At first glance, this looks like a story about a marriage collapsing. It isn't. It's a story about hidden structure, silent protection, and the kind of wealth that changes everything only after the mask comes off. While Clara's husband is busy calculating what he can take, a far older plan is already in motion. Her quiet mother, dismissed by everyone, left behind a fortune. And a final lesson: real power is often built where no one thinks to look.
The architectural model of the Echelon Tower glittered in the middle of the room, a monument to her husband's ego. The last of the Chicago developers had just left their penthouse, leaving behind the ghost of expensive scotch. From across the living room, Julian's voice was as clean and severe as his blueprints, and just as empty of affection. "Amelia, we need to finalize the demolition plan." She was 7 months pregnant. Her father had been gone for only 3 weeks, and the man she'd built her life with was discussing their future as if it were a zoning variance. But this wasn't about a renovation. It was about a teardown. The other woman, it was his chief rival, Colette, the ruthless art dealer who had air-kissed her cheek just an hour before. The woman who had raised a glass to their prosperity, her sharp eyes gleaming as she toasted to bold new acquisitions. That same woman had been commissioning more than just designs from Julian for the last year and a half. They had staged this entire evening, waiting until after her father's memorial service to finally unveil their project. He called her sentimental, said her tastes weren't ambitious enough, and offered her a prepaid luxury condo in Lincoln Park and $15,000 a month, pocket change for a man whose latest building was valued at $800 million. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that her father, Arthur, the quiet, unassuming art history professor who lived in a tiny bungalow in Evanston and always smelled of old books, had been a silent early collector of works now worth nearly $1 billion. And he had left every single painting to his pregnant daughter. This is the story of a woman who was told her life was scheduled for demolition, only to discover she was about to own the whole city block. She lost a husband and an adversary she once admired, but realized she'd been the curator of her own fortune the entire time. Yet the true inheritance wasn't the art collection. It was a quiet strength cultivated in dusty archives, something no market downturn could ever touch. Stay with me, because this story is a reminder of a truth every woman deserves to own. Your value was never determined by the man who drew you out of the plans. It was never confined to the glass walls of a home he constructed, or the last name you adopted. Sometimes the people you build your world with will be the ones who swing the wrecking ball. Sometimes the foundation you trusted for stability is the one that crumbles beneath you. But their hostile takeover is not your story. Your grand reopening is. Arthur raised his daughter with barely a penny on purpose because he believed that a woman who learns to find her own beauty in the forgotten sketches will never be lost in someone else's shadow. This story is for every woman who has ever been called too quiet, who has ever been made to feel like a first draft, who has ever had to kneel and pick up the shattered fragments of her own heart from the floor and wonder how to piece them back together. You were never a footnote. You just hadn't seen your own catalog. If this story hangs in the gallery of your heart, if you feel that structural unfairness and that spark of a creative renaissance, then you have found your collection. This channel is for women who find their power in the restoration, women who build their own museums, women who remember the combination to their own vaults. If you're not already in our community, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an exhibition. Tell me in the comments, when did you discover a masterpiece within yourself you never knew was there? I read every single one of your stories, and they become the inspiration for the ones we feature next. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their own priceless value today. And if you're ready for another story of a comeback, check out the video I've linked for you on the screen. Now let's begin. The last Scotch glass had been removed, and the glowing model of the Echelon Tower was the only guest left in their living room. Behind her, Julian's voice was level, which was always far more unsettling than his anger. "Amelia, we need to discuss the transfer of assets." The words belonged in a contract, not in their home, not tonight. She stood in the center of their Gold Coast penthouse, barefoot, 7 months pregnant, the silk maternity dress feeling like a costume. The charcuterie board she'd spent the afternoon curating, with delicacies from a small farm in Wisconsin, sat untouched on the marble island. Her father, Arthur, had taught her that appreciating art was an act of devotion, a way of cherishing beauty without needing praise. But she had been performing for an audience of one, and he hadn't even been paying attention. It had been 21 days. That was all. 21 days since she'd stood on a windy bluff overlooking Lake Michigan, watching her father's ashes scatter, while Julian had been closing a deal on a critical and non-negotiable call near the car. She'd written it off as his inability to process emotion. Some people, she'd told herself, just don't have the architecture for grief. She turned to face him now. Julian was a silhouette against the glittering lights of the Chicago skyline. His custom-tailored suit was perfect, his posture rigid. He hadn't reached a decision. He had signed off on a final blueprint. On the counter beside him, her tablet lit up. He had shared a file to it, a single sterile document titled, quote, asset _ relocation _ agreement .pdf. "It's the most logical progression, Amelia," he said, his voice flat. She glanced at the tablet, then at the untouched charcuterie, then at the man she had been married to for 4 years, the man who had proposed to her at the unveiling of his first skyscraper. She'd mistaken it for a grand romantic structure, a public declaration. A man so confident in their partnership that he wanted the entire city to bear witness. Now she saw the truth. It wasn't a monument, it was a press release. He had acquired her. Why? The word was a whisper, swallowed by the immense silent space of the penthouse. She despised the crack in her own voice, the way it turned a question into a structural flaw. Julian straightened the cuff of his shirt, a precise, calculated movement. The same gesture he used before presenting a new design to the city council. "Our aesthetics are no longer compatible, Amelia. My career requires a partner who can operate at my level, someone with a more significant public profile. I am your wife. I am carrying your child, and you will both be properly taken care of. I've arranged an apartment for you in Lincoln Park. It's fully furnished, 2 bedrooms. You won't have to deal with any of the logistics." An apartment. He had already arranged it. This wasn't a breakup. It was a managed demolition. And in that moment, the facade began to crumble. All the little details her heart had noted and archived came flooding back. The faint, smoky scent of amber on his jacket last week, not her light floral perfume, but Colette's signature scent. His tablet, which was now protected by a new facial recognition lock. The digital art display in their entryway, which he claimed was just for showcasing his own renderings. "Is it Colette?" she asked, and the answer was already hanging in her soul. Julian's jaw tightened. His gaze shifted to the shimmering architectural model. "This is about a strategic realignment," he said. But his entire being was a broken contract. She knew that tell. She'd seen him do it with investors for years. When a project was over budget, he'd focus on the model instead of their faces. When the truth was inconvenient, he stared at the blueprints. She walked toward the island, not to plead, not to negotiate. She picked up the small, ornate knife meant for the hard salami. She held it, the cool steel a grounding weight against her warm skin. She wasn't thinking of violence. She was thinking of how cleanly you could cut something away. She stared at her reflection in the polished blade, a distorted pregnant woman she didn't know. The baby kicked inside her a strong, assertive thump, a reminder that she was a collection of two. Julian watched her for a moment, a flicker of something, not concern, but risk management, in his eyes. He straightened his jacket. "The moving service is scheduled for 9 a.m., he said, "to transfer your effects." He turned and left. The minimalist door slid shut with a soft, mechanical click. Amelia was alone in a glass tower that had never been a home. She set the knife down and leaned against the cold marble, her belly pressing into the stone. On her tablet, the PDF for her new contracted life glowed. She could smell the leftover goat cheese, the sharp scent of olives, and the faint amber perfume that Colette had left in her wake. Her father's scent had been old paper and cherry tobacco and home. Her tablet buzzed again on the counter. An email. It was from Colette, her rival, her peer, the woman who had put a hand on her arm at the memorial service, the woman who had advised her on which gallery was best for consigning a small piece from her father's collection, the woman who had been in this very room an hour ago and toasted to her family. The email read, "Consider it handled. Let me know if you have issues with the liquidation. C." It wasn't an offer of help. It was a closing statement, a receipt. Amelia felt the air go out of her. It was the brutal professionalism of it, the assumption that she was just another asset to be moved. The message didn't come 10 minutes after Julian left. It had been sent before his footsteps had even faded down the hall. They were working from the same set of plans. She didn't reply. She couldn't. She placed the tablet face down on the counter. She rested a hand on her belly where their daughter was shifting, blissfully unaware. "It's our story now, little girl," she murmured into the quiet of the high-rise. She didn't grasp it fully in that moment, but the unanswered business email wasn't the real betrayal. The true evidence, the key that would dismantle her entire world, was glowing softly on the laptop on the kitchen island. Dawn arrived, a pale, cold light creeping over Lake Michigan. Claire hadn't slept a minute. Just before sunrise, she had left their bed and padded into the nursery she had designed. The walls were a soft, cloudy gray, and she'd spent weeks painting a whimsical mural of the Chicago skyline, with stars twinkling over the famous buildings her husband Julian had helped design. The crib, a sleek piece of modern maple, was one she'd put together herself after Julian promised to have his assistant handle it and then forgot. She settled into the plush glider her own mother had insisted on buying them, a gift from their family home in Lincoln Park. It smelled of lavender and new beginnings, a safe smell. She rocked gently, listening to their voices again, not Julian's, but the ones she'd heard just an hour ago when, with a knot of dread in her stomach, she had opened a project file on his laptop and found a saved audio note. Julian and Sophie, their voices hushed and intimate. "The plan is perfect. She'll be comfortable and out of the picture before the new year." He had used her pregnancy to close a deal with a family-oriented developer, right there at the celebratory dinner. A man burnishing his image, a man showcasing his latest, most personal acquisition. Claire picked up her phone, scrolling to her sister's name, Amelia. Her thumb hovered, then she pressed the call button. It went directly to the recording. "Hey, you've reached Amelia. I'm either in a deposition or on a trail run. You know what to do, and I'll get back to you when I can breathe again." Her sister's voice, so full of purpose. Claire ended the call and dialed it once more, just to feel that strength by proxy. "Hey, you've reached Amelia." Claire set the laptop on her growing belly, the baby giving a gentle flutter from within as she closed her eyes. By 2 a.m, she had formed a resolution. It wasn't a grand, dramatic plan for revenge. It was the quiet, steely decision a woman makes when the ground beneath her has crumbled to ash and she needs to find out why. Julian's laptop was on the coffee table. He hadn't even bothered to close it. A careless oversight, unless he was so convinced of her passivity that he believed she'd never look. That was Julian's view of her in a nutshell. A beautiful, artistic soul to complete his public image, and he'd seen her that way from the day they met. It was the foundation of their entire relationship. His absolute certainty that she was too gentle, too trusting, too lost in her own creative world to ever question the reality he presented. She didn't have to guess a password. He never logged out. She'd been looking for a draft of a speech he was giving when a file name caught her eye. Vance Tower, Comm Strategy. A dry, corporate title. But a sharp, cold curiosity compelled her, and she clicked it open. Her universe fractured. It wasn't a press release. The document was a shared draft of Sophie. Not Sophie, her maid of honor and oldest friend. Just Sophie, whose name was at the top with an editor tag, a mark of professional intimacy that looked like it had been there forever. Claire began to scroll back, following the comment history to the document's origin. Her hands felt distant and numb, but her pulse was a hammering drum. The document was created 18 months ago, not some fleeting mistake, not a recent affair. 18 months, before the wedding at the Art Institute, before she saw the 2 pink lines on the test, before she put her journalism career on hold, before this life was even real. There were notes in the margins. My muse, S. There were references to shared trips, a boutique hotel in Miami for an architectural conference, a weekend in Aspen he'd called a solo retreat to clear his head. And there were comments. Sophie describing watching the sunrise from the penthouse of his newest building, the one where he had proposed to Claire under a sky full of fireworks. She kept scrolling, and the planning became more audacious. A comment from Sophie dated on the anniversary of Claire's father's death, a day Claire had spent at the cemetery, clutching Julian's hand while Sophie stood on her other side, a pillar of support. How much more of this performance art can we take? Sophie had written. Julian had replied in the document within the hour. Patience, my love, we just need to finalize the domestic asset transfer. Domestic asset transfer. As if Claire were a piece of property to be signed over. As if her grief were a project delay he had to manage before breaking ground on his new life. She wasn't losing her mind. She had felt the distance growing. The client dinners that stretched past midnight, the emptiness in his eyes when she talked about the baby, the way he angled his body away from her in bed, the way Sophie always seemed to know his moods and his schedule before he did. She had felt it in that deep, primal part of her soul where intuition is born. She knew. She scrolled past the project timelines and the coded affections, past the blueprint of their lies. And then she found the section about the baby. Julian's words typed in a crisp sans serif font beneath a section titled Legacy Planning. The heir secures the trust but complicates the exit strategy. The optics need to be flawless. Sophie's inserted comment was a single word. Perfect. An endorsement. For her best friend, for the child she claimed she couldn't wait to spoil, the word perfect. Claire's hands started to tremble, the laptop shaking in her lap. She clutched it to her chest, and the baby delivered a sudden, hard kick against the warm metal, as if it sensed the fight to come, as if it were already on her side. She closed the file, then opened it again, closed it, opened it. She pleaded with the screen to rearrange itself into a different narrative, one she could survive. A story where her husband adored her, a story where her best friend was loyal, a story where perfect was about a nursery and not a deception. But the digital text was unyielding. It never is. She dialed Sophie's number. Not for a fight, she wasn't built for that yet. She called because she had to hear her voice, to measure its sound against the cold, cruel words and understand how they could exist in the same person. She needed to map the canyon between someone who could sound so full of love and be so completely empty of it. Claire, hi! Sophie's voice was bright and warm like sunshine. You read my mind. I saw the most gorgeous cashmere baby blanket today. We have to go get it this weekend. My treat. How are you feeling? Every syllable was a meticulously constructed falsehood. The casual warmth, the easy affection. It was a masterful performance from a woman who had been sleeping with her husband for a year and a half while planning her baby shower. Maybe, Claire heard her own voice say, the same non-committal word she'd given Julian earlier when he'd asked if she was excited about the nursery. But this time, the word felt like ash in her mouth, like the final, dull thud of a vault door swinging shut. She ended the call, walked into the vast marble bathroom, braced her hands on the cold vanity, and was violently sick. This wasn't morning sickness. That was long gone. This was something else. This was her body physically rejecting a truth so toxic it couldn't be contained. It was a sickness of the spirit. She splashed her face with cold water, looking at the stranger in the mirror, 32 years old, 7 months pregnant. Her eyes were dark pools of shock, and the silk robe, a gift from Julian for their first anniversary, felt like a costume. She didn't look like a woman whose life had just been shattered. She just looked tired, as if she had been tired down to her bones for a very long time and was only just now understanding why. The cruelest part wasn't the affair. It wasn't the secret trips or the shared document. The absolute deepest cut was about her baby, her daughter, the tiny person she was painstakingly creating inside her. A person she already loved with a fierceness that eclipsed everything else. Perfect. That was the word they used for a plan to erase her. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, feeling the strong, steady roll of a life that belonged only to her. "I am so sorry," she whispered to her daughter. "I'm so sorry this is the world I chose for you." Then she pulled her shoulders back. She dried her hands on a plush towel embroidered with the elegant V of the Vance family. She had work to do. That laptop was a crime scene, and she was a journalist again. She ignored the folders of architectural renderings and the notes for his upcoming speeches. She spent the next hour digging through the digital architecture of her husband's life. And in the quiet gray light before the city woke up, she found it. A folder in his cloud storage labeled Personal Finance. Inside was a file named Marital Agreement. It contained a scanned PDF of an email chain between Julian and his family's lawyer, a Mr. Davies, from a prestigious firm on LaSalle Street. The conversation began a week after their wedding. Davies had written, "Julian, I'm flagging this again. The prenuptial agreement was never filed with the court. We must rectify this immediately. As it stands, the document is nothing more than paper." Julian's reply was arrogant. "I'll get to it." A second email from Davies, sent 4 months later. "Julian, this is now a serious liability. The prenup is invalid. If this isn't corrected, Claire would be entitled to 50% of all marital assets under Illinois law." Julian's final response: "She's a romantic. She'll never cause a problem. Drop it." "She's a romantic. She'll never cause a problem." Claire read the sentence 5 times. The first time, it was a blow. The second, it was a horrifying moment of clarity. The third time, it was a promise. The third betrayal felt like a slow, steady burn along a fuse she never knew she had, leading straight to a core of pure steel. Without a solid prenuptial agreement, she was entitled to half his architecture firm, half his portfolio, half of every cold glass tower he'd ever built. His own lawyer had warned him about it twice, but Marcus had waved it off, convinced she was too gentle for such things. His magnificent arrogance had always been his greatest blind spot, and she was finally learning that a person's blind spots are where you find the best leverage. But there was another, colder current running beneath it all. This one flowed between Marcus and his mother, Beatrice Thorne. Beatrice, who always made a point of calling Clara by her first name, but with a tone that made it sound like an unfortunate nickname. Beatrice, who for their first anniversary had gifted her a rare, leather-bound history of the Thorne family's architectural dynasty with an inscription that read, "To Marcus, for the future he is building." Her name was nowhere to be found. Beatrice, who looked at Clara as if she were a temporary installation in a permanent gallery. Isabel's family has far more strategic holdings in the Dubai project, Beatrice had written in an email Clara found tucked in the book. That is the alliance that needs to be solidified. Conclude your current arrangement with minimal fuss. Marcus's reply, I'm managing it. She'll get the Lincoln Park penthouse and will be grateful for the soft landing. Grateful, as if her entire life, her love, their unborn child, were just a project to be smoothly decommissioned. As if she should thank him for the privilege of being discarded so neatly. Clara closed the laptop, the screen going dark with a quiet snap. Clara drifted into the nearly finished nursery and lowered herself into the rocking chair. On a shelf, a digital photo frame cycled through their life in pictures. She touched the screen, freezing it on an image of her and Sophie at the Art Institute, years before everything became so complicated. They were on the museum steps, beaming, raising paper cups of coffee in a mock toast. That afternoon, they'd made a silly, solemn promise to curate each other's first major art show, no matter where their careers took them. It was a pact made by two young women who couldn't yet imagine the kind of compromises the world would demand. She swiped to the next photo, the proposal. It had made headlines on every major news outlet in Chicago. Marcus, on one knee in front of 2,000 people, moments after the ribbon-cutting ceremony for his masterpiece skyscraper, the Apex Tower. She was in a simple blue dress. He was in a tailored suit. She had believed it was the purest, most spontaneous romance. He was just so overwhelmed by the moment, she'd told her friends. He said he looked out at the city, saw me standing there, and knew he couldn't wait another second. She had glowed with pride every time she recounted that story. She wasn't glowing now. Now she could see the perfectly placed news cameras, the reporters who'd been tipped off, the timing that coincided perfectly with the announcement of his firm landing a massive international contract. It wasn't a proposal. It was a masterfully executed press release. Another swipe. Her mother at the wedding. Evelyn, in a simple but elegant dress she'd found at a vintage shop, standing near the floral displays with a polite, reserved smile. But her eyes. Clara saw it now, captured in the high-definition photo, the subtle details she'd missed in the chaos of the day. Her mother's eyes held a deep, worried caution. Evelyn's words from that afternoon echoed in her memory, spoken in a quiet moment away from the guests. It was the new smart lighting system that brought it all down, a gift from Marcus that was supposed to seamlessly integrate their home. While Clara was syncing it with her devices, Marcus's entire cloud drive began to populate on her tablet's main screen. His private calendar filled with appointments she'd never heard of, dozens of recurring meetings simply labeled Lakefront Project. Curious, she opened his newly synced photo library. Tucked away between architectural shots and their vacation photos was a private album she'd never seen before, titled The Point. It wasn't a building design for a client, it was a home. A stunning, secluded lake house nestled in the woods on the Michigan shore, complete with blueprints and a mood board filled with intimate photos of Marcus and Isabel on that very property. His arm was wrapped around her waist. Her head was resting on his shoulder. A subfolder held notes in Isabel's distinct, sharp handwriting. Our view for morning coffee, one caption read. A studio for me, an office for you. Our new beginning. Our new beginning. Clara stepped back from the tablet, the words stealing the air from the cavernous penthouse Marcus had designed. She suddenly felt caged, suffocated by the cold marble and glass. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the gray Chicago sky stretching out over Lake Michigan. She stared at the skyline he had helped build, 1,000 distant lives that felt infinitely more real than her own. She placed a hand over her swelling belly as the baby stirred. This perfect marriage, this visionary husband, this curated future, it was all just a blueprint for someone else's life. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. A chilling, methodical calm settled over her. It's just us now, little one, she thought. you and me. For the next hour, she moved with quiet precision, packing a weekend bag, not with the heat of anger, but with the clear-eyed focus of a survivor. As she zipped the bag shut, the building's intercom chimed. A courier stood in the gleaming hallway, dripping rainwater onto the polished marble floor. He held out a crisp, heavy envelope from a law firm she'd never heard of, Davies and Sterling. She signed for it on his tablet and closed the door, the thick paper feeling heavy and important in her hand. Sterling. It was her mother's maiden name, a name Evelyn had always laughed off as too grand for a public school art teacher, a name completely disconnected from the stories she told of growing up in a modest bungalow in Oak Park, a simple life of community centers and used paperback books. The letter inside was thick with legal language, requesting her presence to discuss the final settlement of her mother's estate. It used phrases that felt like they were from a different planet. Substantial holdings, controlling interests, testamentary trusts, fiduciary responsibilities. She almost tossed it aside as a mistake, a clerical error that had nothing to do with her mother's quiet life of grading student projects and tending her small garden. But that name stopped her. Sterling. It carried a certain weight, a hint of a history she had never been told. She laid the envelope on the marble kitchen island right next to her open laptop, which displayed a search for Chicago's most formidable divorce attorneys. 2 doorways, one leading away from the man who was building a new life without her, and one leading into the world of a mother who, it seemed, had hidden her own life from her. She had to choose between defending her heart and securing her child's future. Neither seemed possible at that moment. She stood in the kitchen, a lone silhouette against the glittering backdrop of the city lights, and stared at the 2 choices. The life she had known was a lie, and the life her mother had lived was a complete mystery. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, she was just a woman, 8 months pregnant, standing in the ruins of her marriage, struggling to take a breath. The next morning, her hand trembled slightly as she dialed the number on the elegant letterhead. She steeled herself for a dismissive receptionist or an automated menu. Instead, a man answered on the second ring. His voice was warm and measured, the kind of voice that suggested patience was his natural state of being. "Arthur Davies," he said. "This is Clara," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "I'm calling about a letter. About my mother, Evelyn." There was a brief, respectful pause. "Ah, Clara, yes, I was hoping you would call. Your mother mentioned you in every conversation we had." The pride in her voice was truly something to behold. "You knew my mother?" "For almost 40 years, he said softly. "She was a remarkable woman. If you'll permit me to ask, Clara, did Evelyn ever talk to you about the Sterling family?" Clara leaned against a kitchen stool, the cold metal a small shock. The view of the Hancock Tower seemed to taunt her. "No," she said, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her. "My mother was a school teacher. She lived in a rented bungalow in Oak Park. She drove a 15-year-old Civic, and her greatest luxury was buying new paintbrushes. She never once mentioned anyone named Sterling." Arthur Davies paused for a moment. When he spoke again, his words carefully began to demolish the entire foundation of Clara's world. "Your mother was Evelyn Sterling, the sole heir to Jonathan Sterling, the founder of Sterling Steel, one of the original industrial titans of the Midwest. When she was 21 years old, she walked away from her inheritance, changed her name, and built a life on her own terms. But she never gave up what belonged to you." Clara gripped the edge of the counter to keep herself upright. The penthouse felt like it was tilting on its axis. The baby fluttered inside her, a fierce, solid presence as everything else dissolved. "I don't understand," she breathed out. "Your mother," Arthur explained, "placed her controlling shares of Sterling Steel into a highly complex trust. She spent decades quietly growing that fortune, diversifying into biomedical engineering and clean energy, all managed by this firm. She also anonymously founded and funded a foundation that provides art scholarships to students in underprivileged schools. She was an intensely private person. How much? The question felt small and pathetic, like asking for the time in the middle of an earthquake. The total value of the estate, Arthur said, his tone perfectly steady, is currently estimated at $3.8 billion. The number didn't register. It was just a series of sounds. 3.8 billion. 7 unpublished manuscripts. The man who taught her how to find the soul of a building. The man who paid for her first research trip with his own meager stipend. The man who beamed with pride when Clara landed her first junior fellowship, saying, "See, my girl, your own voice is stronger than any echo." 7 unpublished manuscripts from the most revered architectural critic in Chicago. The first feeling to break through her grief wasn't honor or shock. It was a searing bolt of betrayal. "He never told me," she said, her voice a tight, dangerous whisper. "My entire life, I hunted for footnotes. I worked through grad school as a tour guide. I ate instant noodles to afford rare books. He watched me struggle, and he never said a word." "He wanted you to build your own foundation first," Mr. Davies said gently. "He had seen what his name could do to young talent. His own legacy became a cage. Arthur wanted you to have an integrity that no one could claim he gave you. He was going to tell you, Clara, after the baby came. He left a letter explaining everything. It's with his personal papers. I can have a scan sent over immediately." "Yes, please," Clara managed. The file appeared in her inbox moments later. Clara went into the nursery, the room she and Liam had painted a soft urban gray just last month. The unassembled modernist crib and the designer mobile of famous skyscrapers felt like artifacts from someone else's life. She sank to the floor, leaning against the wall, and opened the file on her phone. Her mentor's familiar, angular script filled the screen. "My dearest Clara," it began, "if you are reading this, then my last deadline has passed. I am so sorry I never found the right moment to tell you the truth. I ran from the weight of the Vance legacy because, in my world, a name became a brand. It made people value signatures over substance. I needed you to grow up free from that shadow, to know your worth was in your insight. But this archive is your inheritance. Use it to be safe. Use it to be heard. And if anyone ever tries to silence your voice, you remember that you come from a line of thinkers as strong as the steel frames that hold this city up. For my sharpest eye, Arthur." Clara traced the signature on the screen. She read the letter a second time, then a third, before the calm she'd been desperately holding on to finally fractured. It wasn't quiet crying. It was a raw, guttural sob that tore from the depths of her soul, a sound of profound loss and staggering love. She cried for the mentor she knew, the fiercely private intellectual, and for the giant of criticism whose full genius the world would now see. She cried for the man she thought she had built a life with, and the future that had just been demolished. She wept for the man who believed in her enough to let her find her own footing, to force her to be resilient. A man who preferred the dusty silence of the archives to the flash of high-profile ribbon cuttings and, in doing so, gave his protege the one thing a famous connection could never provide, a truly independent perspective. She closed the file, pressing the phone to her chest, and began to rock slowly on the nursery floor, an ancient, instinctual motion of comfort. She rocked until the sobs subsided, and the silence in the apartment felt less like an absence and more like a cleared sight. My mentor wasn't hiding his work from me, she realized with a sudden clarity. He was preparing me for it. The baby kicked, a firm, definite push from inside her. Clara let out a watery, shaky laugh that held more power than sorrow. She placed both hands over her belly. "Your grandfather Arthur," she whispered, "was the most brilliant, principled man I have ever known, and he just handed us the blueprints to this entire city. She stayed there for a long time, rocking, breathing, feeling the immense weight of a life's unseen work settle onto her, not as a burden, but as a mantle of authority. The weight of that legacy settled on her shoulders like a coat she was finally ready to wear. Then she picked up her phone and called Mr. Davies back. "Mr. Davies," she said, "I need you to keep the full nature of this archive completely private. No press releases, no announcements, no contact with my husband or his firm." "Of course. May I ask why?" "Because I want to see what people really are when they think I have no leverage." There was a short silence, then Davies chuckled, a low, appreciative sound. The sound of a man who had just recognized Arthur Vance's chosen successor. "Your mentor," he said, "would be incredibly proud." Liam called on Thursday morning, his voice crisp and efficient, the same tone he used with contractors and junior designers. "I need you to clear your things out of the home office by tomorrow," he said. "I'm having a colleague come over to help me finalize the pitch for the Nightingale Tower." A colleague. He didn't even have the courage to say her name, to offer the thinnest veneer of respect. A colleague. "I've arranged for a $5,000 transfer for your monthly needs," he continued. "It's more than fair, under the circumstances. My accountant will handle the rest." $5,000 a month, from a man whose current project had a budget in the tens of millions. The sheer arrogance of the gesture was a monument in itself. It felt like a developer tossing a handful of gravel at a historian and expecting thanks. "Fine," Clara said, her voice a calm, empty space. "I'll be out by Friday." "Good. I'm glad we can be professional about this." Professional. As if intellectual theft and emotional cruelty were just parts of a business plan. As if evicting your pregnant wife 5 weeks after her mentor's death was just a strategic reallocation of assets. She hung up and stood in the Chicago brownstone, looking at the curated life he had designed, the minimalist furniture he had chosen, the architectural prints he pretended to understand, the view of the skyline that had never once felt like her own. "Let him think I'm broken," she thought. "Let him believe I'm grateful for his table scraps. He has no idea that I'm holding the original drafts that make his entire design philosophy seem legitimate." But she wouldn't just tear it all down. That wasn't what Arthur, the critic, had taught her. He didn't teach her to demolish a building out of spite. He taught her that sometimes you have to let the structural flaws reveal themselves before you can champion something built to last. Friday came. Clara arrived at their brownstone at 10 in the morning with her laptop bag and zero sentimentality. What she found was more insultingly staged than she could have imagined. Isabel was there in Clara's office wearing one of Liam's expensive cashmere sweaters. She was drinking an espresso from Clara's favorite mug, the one with the unique ceramic glaze from a small studio in Kyoto, a gift from Arthur. And she was sorting through Clara's research notes on the large light table, the one calibrated perfectly for analyzing historical blueprints. The sheer audacity was stunning. It wasn't just the affair, but the casual conquest of her intellectual space, the way Isabel occupied Clara's office, handling Clara's research as if she had already been named the firm's new historian in residence. "Clara," Isabel said, setting the mug aside. She approached her, hands raised in a gesture of rehearsed empathy, the kind a PR agent makes before delivering bad news. "I am just so terribly sorry. I never wanted you to be hurt by this. I know this must be an awful shock." The words were polished and smooth, the tone perfectly pitched. If Clara hadn't seen the emails on Arthur's synced drive, she might have fallen for it. She might have believed the performance and blamed herself, and never known that this was the woman who was not only sleeping with her husband, but was systematically plotting to write her out of his career. "When did you decide to start rewriting my research on early Chicago modernism?" Clara asked, her voice quiet and sharp as a scalpel. Isabel's mask of sympathy slipped, a flicker of static in the broadcast. "What are you talking about?" "The new pitch deck, the one where you attribute my theories on Sullivan's ornamentation to your own new interpretation and then toast to your future, joking about how my pregnancy was perfect timing." The blood drained from Isabel's face, then surged back in a defiant blush. The shift was immediate, like a soft architectural rendering snapping to a harsh, unshaded wireframe. "Fine," Isabel said, her voice now stripped of its manufactured warmth. What remained was brittle and sharp. "You want the truth? He was creatively trapped with you. We operate on a level you can't comprehend. I'm sorry it's not neat, but our partnership has a much bigger future." "You plagiarized my work," Clara said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a diagnosis, delivered with the quiet authority of a master historian identifying a forgery. "I deserved a collaborator, not a thief." Liam walked in then. He'd been on a call in the living room, heard the shift in tone, and entered the office. With the easy confidence of a man who believes he designed the very room he stands in. "Let's not get emotional, Clara," he said. "Clara, her full name, not Claire, not Honey. The formal, detached label you use for a consultant you're about to fire." He went to stand by Isabel, placing a hand on the small of her back, a clear display of alliance. The architect and his new partner standing together in Clara's workspace, asking Clara not to get emotional about being betrayed and professionally erased. She watched them for a long moment, observing. The way they stood, the way Isabel leaned into his touch, a posture both possessive, polished, and performative. They were Chicago's golden couple, a perfect synergy of vision and intellect. And that was the part that twisted the knife. Not that it was happening, but that it had been happening long enough for them to have their own private routines. Clara left it all behind. She didn't pack the award statuettes, the expensive first editions on architecture, the life Julian had so meticulously designed for her. She walked away from everything he had bought because none of it had ever felt like it belonged to her. She took only 3 things: her personal laptop, the first ultrasound image of their child, and the dog-eared sketchbook containing her original thesis drawings. The steel door of the service elevator slid open with a low groan. The building's longtime doorman, a kind man named Miguel who always saved her the morning paper, offered a look of deep, unspoken sympathy. "Ma'am," he murmured, his voice gentle, "you gave his work its soul. You deserve so much more." She managed a faint, fragile smile. "I know, Miguel. It's time to build something for myself." The heavy doors rumbled shut. The penthouse, their glass box in the sky, vanished from sight. Every floor she descended felt like stripping away another layer of a life that was now a lie. By the time she merged onto Lakeshore Drive, she was no longer Julian Croft's wife. She was Clara Hayes, her father's daughter, and she was finished letting someone else draw her blueprints. She paused at a stoplight for what felt like an eternity. The tears wouldn't come. She just sat there, her hands spread across the swell of her belly. The worn leather of the steering wheel was a familiar comfort. The baby shifted, a tiny, forceful flutter that was a promise of the future. Through the glass, she watched the iconic Chicago skyline cut through the evening gloom, a city built on grit and ambition. Everyone moving, everyone building something new. She did what she'd always done when a design felt dishonest. She went back to the drawing board. She put the car in drive, easing into the river of taillights, and headed not towards some sterile temporary hotel, but to a restored warehouse district on the south side. She pulled up to a structure of weathered brick and iron, a place that smelled of sawdust, artisan coffee, and raw potential. Her father's old office. She had kept the lease after he passed, a quiet sanctuary for her own work, a space that was hers and hers alone. The office was spare and true. The air was cool and still. For a fleeting second, she could almost hear her father's voice, that Arthur was in the studio, humming some old jazz standard, carefully sharpening a row of graphite pencils with a brass sharpener he'd had since before Clara was born. But the loft was silent, and the quiet confirmed everything. She crossed the threshold, letting the heavy fire door click shut behind her, and set her laptop bag down by the flat files. Her father's familiar tweed jacket was still on its hook, a faint aroma of pipe tobacco and old paper clinging to the frayed collar. His enormous drafting table stood like a guardian near the window, a titan of oak and steel. Not innovative, not minimalist, but it was where buildings with heart were born. Arthur used to say that buildings were like people. The finest designs weren't always the most extravagant. They were the ones with solid foundations, the ones built to withstand Chicago's brutal seasons. A roll of dog-eared blueprints was still held by a rubber band on the drafting table. Studies in structural integrity from the Gold Coast, her grandfather's final passion project. He used to sketch every evening after dinner, and the sharp, clean smell of graphite and old paper would fill their downtown apartment like a comforting presence. Clara would fall asleep to the soft scratch of his pencil on vellum, certain the world's most beautiful secrets were taking shape under his hands. Arthur's silver-rimmed glasses lay on a stack of sketches next to a forgotten mug of cold tea. Monday's Tribune was still on a stool he had passed on a Tuesday. Clara drifted through the studio, her fingertips ghosting over every surface, the shelves crammed with worn books on modernist architecture and city planning. The window where her grandfather had taped up zoning maps with handwritten notes. She opened the wide, flat drawers of a steel filing cabinet, not searching for anything in particular, just reconnecting with the instruments of his life's work, the tangible proof of a life spent building things that last. In the rearmost drawer, she discovered what she hadn't realized she was missing: a heavy, locked leather document tube. It was vintage, the brass caps tarnished from a lifetime of use. She didn't need a key. She knew the 3-digit combination from memory. Inside were not CAD printouts, but a single hand-drawn manuscript of plans. The kind you don't digitize, the kind you protect. A worn photograph was tucked into the roll, showing a young man with a confident grin, holding a T-square in front of the half-finished skyscraper that would make him a legend. Her grandfather, barely 30, his eyes blazing with a focus Clara knew from her own reflection. He was celebrating the project that would define his career, the start of his legacy. Tucked deep inside the blueprints was a single folded page from a sketchbook. It was a detailed drawing of a woman rendered on a cocktail napkin from a bar she recognized. It was Sasha, the junior analyst from Leo's firm. Beneath the sketch, in her grandfather's precise script, was a note: Leo's little shadow, ambition you can smell from across the room. The date was from 4 years ago, long before she and Leo were even engaged. This wasn't a new mistake. This was a foundation. Her signature was in the corner of a recent contract, and she remembered her grandfather's words the day she took over the firm. Proof that my girl not only sees the beauty in the world, but has the strength to build it. She was not the betrayed wife. She was her grandfather's heir. The man who taught her that a building's soul was in its bones had once designed embassies in volatile countries. The man who drove a 15-year-old Volvo had his architectural medals tucked away in a dusty box. The man who knew every steelworker by name had refused lucrative contracts from developers he didn't trust. Clara slid to the hardwood floor of the studio and clutched a box of her grandfather's old project slides to her chest. There was no storm of tears. She was beyond that, in the quiet emptiness where shock numbs the body and the mind is too shattered to grieve. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting long geometric shadows across the floor. The studio had no heat. Arthur had always been a man of stark practicality. The thermostat was set to 58, Clara pushed it up, but the building's old boiler only answered with a hollow clang, a promise of warmth it couldn't deliver. She cocooned herself in anything she could find: her grandfather's old university sweater, a heavy canvas drop cloth, the cashmere throw Arthur's first ever client had sent him one Christmas. The baby was agitated, rolling and kicking, a frantic protest against her ribs. At 2:30 in the morning, the tightening began. It came on sharp and sudden, a deep internal clenching. She lay on her grandfather's worn leather sofa, knees drawn up, her hands pressed desperately against her stomach. She tried to recall the instructor's words from her birthing class about false labor, the body simply rehearsing for the real thing. Nothing to be alarmed about, not at 7 months, not typically. But alone in a frigid studio, with the man she was supposed to call for comfort being the very reason for her pain, asterisk, not typically asterisk, felt like a horrifying certainty. And certainty felt like the floor was collapsing beneath her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. No husband, no best friend, no grandfather. Just a cold room filled with a dead man's blueprints and a baby fighting to enter a broken world 2 months early. And there was not a single soul on earth who knew where she was. She dialed the only number she could think of: Dr. Evans's emergency line, her obstetrician, the woman who had calmly answered every question, explained every ultrasound, and soothed every fear. "Dr. Evans's answering service," a steady voice said. "It's Clara Reed. I think I'm having contractions. I'm only 7 months pregnant, and I'm by myself." "All right, Clara, listen carefully to my voice. I want you to take a slow, deep breath in through your nose and then let it all the way out through your mouth. Count to 5 for me on the way in and on the way out. Can you manage that?" She obeyed. In, 2, 3, 4, 5. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5. The painful pressure in her abdomen began to recede, the tight coil slowly loosening. "Excellent," Dr. Evans said, her voice a lifeline. "You're doing perfectly. This is almost certainly caused by the stress you're under. Your baby is safe, and you are safe. But I need you to come in as soon as we open this morning, just so we can be absolutely sure. Can you do that?" "Yes," Clara breathed. "Thank you." She ended the call and lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. A faint stress fracture in the plaster, one she'd never seen before, spiderwebbed from the corner. All the years she had spent in this studio, and she had never once noticed the cracks above her. "Everyone leaves. My father left my mother. My husband built our life on a lie. My grandfather left me with this silence. What did I have left? A baby who had no idea he was being born into a structure that was compromised from the start." At 3:21 in the morning, she opened her phone. She typed asterisk, "Can a marriage survive a long-term affair?" asterisk into the search box. Deleted it. Typed asterisk, "Division of assets, infidelity, Illinois asterisk." Deleted it. Typed asterisk, "I know my husband has been cheating for years asterisk." She stared at the illuminated confession. Deleted that too. She turned the phone face down, pulled the heavy cashmere tighter around her body, and prayed for the sun to rise. Morning arrived, as it always does. A knock at the studio door jolted her from a fitful sleep. It was quiet but firm, the kind of knock that communicated patience and purpose. Clara heaved the heavy oak door open and found a woman standing in the hallway, late 60s, with a sweep of white hair pulled back elegantly, and kind, knowing eyes. She was holding a paper bag that smelled of warm croissants and a large thermos. She wore a tailored wool coat and practical leather boots. This was Leo, her older brother and a corporate lawyer, a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals and was rarely rattled. "Mom would have my hide if I let you hole up in this dark condo alone," Leo said, his voice low and steady. He moved past Clara into the kitchen, setting a large paper bag and a thermos on the marble island. He twisted the cap off the thermos and poured 2 mugs of hot broth, his actions precise and efficient. He found a loaf of bread and a block of cheese and started making grilled cheese sandwiches. He didn't pry, didn't offer empty sympathies, didn't say, "I was so sorry to hear about Julian," or "the restaurant's investors have been calling." He just made food, pulled open the heavy curtains to let in the pale Chicago daylight, and created a small pocket of order in the sprawling, silent condo. When the sandwiches were golden brown, he slid a plate in front of Clara and sat across from her. He took a long sip of the broth, his gaze fixed on her face. "I know about the business plan," Leo said quietly. "I know about Julian and that sommelier. And I know you feel like you're about to fall apart, but you won't. But right now, you don't have to be tough. Right now, you just have to eat this sandwich." Clara ate the sandwich. It was the first real meal she'd managed in days. It tasted of sharp cheddar and butter and a tiny, unexpected flicker of strength. Leo explained the situation the way he presented a legal case, with facts, stripped of emotion. They sat at Julian's polished mahogany desk, and Leo laid out the last few months of his brother-in-law's deception like a damning closing argument. "I suspected something was wrong," Leo began. "I saw them. He took her to that food and wine festival in Aspen, the sommelier, Simone. My firm sponsored a table. His excuse was research, but I saw how he looked at her, how his hand lingered on her back when he thought no one could see. So I started looking into his finances, called it my Fulton Market fraud file, an audit of his new venture." Clara listened, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug, the baby inside her suddenly still. "I reviewed the incorporation documents, not as your brother, but as a lawyer protecting family assets. The payment transfers you found? He was funneling money from your shared accounts to fund a whole new life. He was wrestling with it, Clara. How to tell his pregnant wife that their entire future was a sham without losing everything in the process. The business plan was his roadmap, but I think it was also his exit strategy, a way to set up his new life before telling you the old one was over." The story about a solo culinary retreat was a lie, Leo confirmed, but the timing was breathtakingly cruel. "He's something else, your husband, so arrogant. Julian wanted my firm to handle the legal work for his new restaurant, with Simone as the named partner," he said. "A fusion of expertise. I refused. I told him, right there in my office, that I don't represent thieves. He cut me off after that, called me a jealous, overprotective brother. He stopped coming to family dinners, stopped returning my calls. I raised you to see the truth, no matter how much it hurts. And the plan? Here is the thing about Julian," Leo said, leaning in. "He's a showman, but he's not a genius. He knew those financial records were the only real leverage you'd have. He never thought you'd find them. My last move was giving you the facts so you could build your own future, a real one. Dad walked out and you built a career from nothing. I know you have the steel to do this too." "So he hid it all in a subfolder," Clara whispered, the pieces clicking into place. She had seen the project name, a single sickening phrase, "Our next course." He was mapping it all out, the secret trips to Napa, the dinners, the restaurant on the lakefront, every single lie. None of the food critics who lauded his genius, none of the investors who praised his innovative culinary vision knew that his masterpiece was a blueprint for betrayal, buried deep within their shared server. Leo nodded, his expression a mixture of anger and sympathy. "He was the darling of Chicago's dining scene," he said, "and the most pathological liar I've ever known." The soft chime of the private elevator opening into their foyer broke the heavy silence. Julian's voice echoed from the hall. "Clara? You in the office? My phone must have died." Leo gave Clara a look, a quiet promise of backup. Clara rose, walked to the office doorway, and waited. He appeared, his dark curls artfully messy, his cashmere coat draped over one arm. He was holding a small, perfect chocolate cake from their favorite bakery. He stopped short when he saw Leo, his easy smile tightening. Then his gaze drifted to the monitor. The project was open. The proposal for the new restaurant was displayed on the giant screen in a devastating presentation. Renderings of a romantic, intimate dining room overlooking Lake Michigan. Photos of Julian and Simone, laughing, embedded in the concept slides. Their initials intertwined in the logo design. A screenshot of a text about their future together. There were dozens of files, a complete chronicle of their affair, documented with the cold, meticulous detail of his own business plan. His face went pale, the color draining away until he resembled a block of ice. He stared from the screen to Clara, his jaw slack, unable to form words. Clara looked at the man she thought she was building a future with, at the lies presented in perfect, high-resolution detail, and felt not a wave of grief, but a sudden, steely calm. The baby kicked hard. This was her inheritance, not a messy divorce, not a settlement, but something far more potent, the truth, and the original financial records that proved his entire culinary empire was built with her money, a foundation she was now about to reclaim. The betrayal was revealed with the quiet tap of a keyboard. Clara, 8 months pregnant and sorting digital receipts for their accountant, was cleaning up Chef Julian Vance's cloud storage in their Chicago condo. A password-protected folder titled Napa Prospect caught her eye. It wasn't the $200,000 seed funding that made her breath catch. It was the expense reports hidden within the business plan, receipts for hotel rooms for two, charged during a solo research trip. Her brother, Leo, looked up from his legal pad and saw the blood drain from Clara's face. He knew instantly this wasn't about business. This was a demolition. What Clara did next was something Julian's arrogant, controlling mind could never have foreseen. She didn't scream. She didn't smash a plate. She didn't even call him. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed the number for their primary bank manager, a woman she'd known for years. "Hi, Diane. It's Clara Vance," she said, her voice surprisingly level. "I'm doing a bit of an audit and have a quick question. For a new LLC to draw funds from a joint spousal account, does that require dual written authorization or just one signature?" There was a brief silence, the faint click of a keyboard. "That requires 2 notarized signatures, Clara," the manager replied, her tone professional but concerned. "It's a strict protocol to prevent fraud." The confident swagger in his voice was gone, replaced by the sharp, brittle sound of pure panic. Clara hung up the phone, a real smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks. She didn't need to fight over their assets. She had the bank statements proving he'd been illegally funneling their shared money. But she wanted Julian to feel that sickening lurch, just for a moment. She wanted him to feel the terror of his world collapsing, to see the empire he'd built revealed as a house of cards. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The lights of the Chicago skyline swam together. She found one, the steady pulse of a skyscraper's beacon, and watched until it came into focus. It took 1 week to turn the tables completely. Clara's greatest weapon was her poise. No hysterical phone calls, no cryptic social media posts, no angry emails sent in the middle of the night. She let the legal machine do the work, let her lawyers build the case. The truth, she believed, always comes to the surface, first as a rumor, then as a headline. She hired the most ruthless forensic accounting firm in the city and filed a lawsuit alleging financial fraud, breach of marital trust, and the embezzlement of shared capital to fund a competing enterprise. She claimed her 50%. It wasn't just the lie, it was the audacity. It was him using their shared credit card to book a celebratory dinner for two at a rival's Michelin-starred restaurant with her that felt like the most vicious blow. The reservation alert popped up on their shared tablet on a Tuesday evening. Clara called his cell at 9:20. The voice that answered wasn't the deep, charming tone of Chicago's most celebrated chef, but the shaky, high-pitched voice of a man caught in a lie. The performance was done, only fear was left. "What is this, Clara?" he sputtered. "Are you tracking my reservations now?" She clutched the tablet in her trembling hands. Standing in the middle of the nursery, they had just painted a soft, hopeful yellow. The scent of fresh paint filled the air. The half-written cookbook manuscript sat on the island, a monument to a future that was now a fantasy. "I was a whole person before you, Leo," she whispered to the quiet kitchen. "You just made your spotlight so bright I forgot how to see myself." She ended the call. A single tear didn't fall. Instead, a cold, hard clarity settled deep in her bones. Isabel, his brilliant new sommelier, had posted an Instagram story from the restaurant's private cellar that evening. Her hand rested on Leo's, her smile intimate. Isabel wasn't just the new hire Leo had been mentoring. She was the new life he was building, and Clara was just the foundation he was willing to sacrifice. "Clara," David began, his voice on the phone heavy with reluctance, "I think you need to know. I've been noticing some serious red flags in the finances. Leo's been shifting restaurant profits into a shell account, disguising it as supplier costs. He signed a lease on a penthouse in South Beach last month. It wasn't for you. He's acquiring failing bistros to cook the books. I'm genuinely afraid for the stability of the entire restaurant group." "Thank you, David," she said, her own voice unnervingly steady. "I appreciate you telling me." "The chef I started this journey with is gone," David confessed. Or maybe he was just a character he was playing. She forwarded the files to her legal team. It was another spreadsheet, another doctored invoice, another stone in the fortress of truth she was building around Leo Vance. The inevitable confrontation happened on a Friday evening at his flagship restaurant, Aria, perched on the 44th floor overlooking the city. It was their place, where he'd celebrated his first big award, where they marked every anniversary. The corner table with the sweeping view of the city lights was where he had once sketched their future on a napkin. He chose it deliberately, a pathetic attempt to produce and direct the final scene. And he brought Isabel. That was his second power play. Isabel wore an ornate, custom gold necklace, displaying it like a prize from a competition Clara didn't know she was in. But Clara arrived as a different person. She was grounded, having spent the last 2 weeks at her parents' quiet house on the lake. Her father's unwavering support, her mother's garden, the familiar comfort of her childhood bedroom. It had reminded her of her own worth. She wore a simple dark blue dress and the silver locket her father had given her for her 16th birthday. No gifts from Leo, no designer flash, no armor, just Clara. She ordered a ginger ale and waited. Leo led, of course. He always had to be in charge. "Let's make this simple," he said, his voice tense. "Sign the agreement, take the brownstone, I'll give you $20,000 a month. Be reasonable about this." "I have a different proposal," Clara countered, her tone level and calm. It was a voice she hadn't heard herself use in years, but one her father would have recognized in an instant. "You give me my 40% equity in the restaurant group, and I won't release your financial records detailing the fraud to your investors." The color drained from Leo's face, not red with rage, but a shocking, pasty white. It was the look of a gambler who just realized his sure thing was a bust. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. David wouldn't. "She's bluffing," Isabel chimed in, her voice pitched a little too high. Clara finally looked at Isabel, truly looked at her for the first time since this nightmare started. She saw the woman who had shared a passion with her husband and felt nothing. Not anger, not betrayal, just a cold, hollow space. "I'm not," Clara said, and David didn't have to. Leo's control snapped. His fist hit the table, making the glasses and plates jump. The quiet hum of the restaurant stopped as every head turned toward their table. A manager started to move cautiously in their direction. Leo gave him a look of such venom that the man froze mid-step. Isabel grabbed his arm, trying to calm him. Her face was a mask of fear, not of Clara, but of him, of the man she was now tied to, the volatile, cornered man who slammed tables and treated the staff like they were nothing. Isabel was getting a preview of what she'd won. This was absolutely not the story she had imagined for them. The server placed the bill on the white tablecloth. Ilara put her black credit card on the tray without looking. Her hand was perfectly steady. She rose, gave them both a cool, almost imperceptible nod, and walked through the restaurant's grand oak doors for the last time. The consequences were immediate. Leo hired a shark from a major downtown law firm, a woman known for leaving her opponents with nothing. Leo's mother, Catherine Vance, called Ilara that night. The conversation lasted less than a minute. "You will not destroy my son's reputation," Catherine said, her voice as crisp as a cold winter morning. Every word was a carefully aimed dart. "We will ruin you." "Catherine," Ilara replied, her tone even, "your son ruined himself. I'm just cleaning up the mess." She ended the call. Catherine called back 2 more times. Ilara let them go to voicemail. The next week, she drove to see her great-uncle, Simon. He was the one who had stayed behind when her father left the family's rigid, old-money manufacturing empire. He was the patriarch her father had defied, a man who commanded a sprawling estate on the North Shore that felt more like a corporate campus than a home. But the man who greeted her was not the fearsome titan from family stories. At 75, he was frail and thin, with the weary look of someone who had spent too much time alone with his regrets. His eyes, however, were still sharp and clear, and in them Ilara saw an emotion she knew all too well: loss. He looked at her and his polished facade cracked. "You have your father's eyes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My God, you have his spirit." He led her inside, showing her the vast library with its leather-bound books where her father had plotted his different life, the garage where they had rebuilt a vintage motorcycle together. He told her stories about her father as a young man, passionate, brilliant, arguing with his own father at the dinner table about the morality of a hostile takeover. "I should have left with him," Simon said, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have had his courage. But I was a coward. By the time I realized my mistake, my whole life had gone by." He offered Ilara his entire arsenal of resources, his legal team, his forensic accountants, the powerful network of contacts he had built over 50 years. Ilara accepted, but on one condition that could not be negotiated. "No media," she stated firmly, "no war in the newspapers. I only want to protect my child's future and create something that belongs to me." Simon nodded, and for the first time, a look of peace seemed to soften the tired lines around his eyes. "You are more your father's daughter than you will ever know," he said. That evening, in her mother's cozy kitchen, Ilara helped make her dad's favorite pot roast. They didn't speak about lawsuits or corporations. They spoke about him. Her mother told her stories Ilara had never heard before. Her dad, at 16, sneaking out to play his guitar at blues clubs on the South Side. Her dad, at 20, telling his own father that a person's character was their true asset, not their trust fund. Her dad, choosing love over a dynasty, choosing a meaningful life over a gilded cage, choosing to raise a daughter who knew her own worth from the very beginning. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of slow-cooked food with memories and gentle laughter. And for those few hours, her father's quiet integrity felt like a warm, solid presence in the room. Leo's empire didn't collapse because of Ilara. It ate itself alive. Daniel Chen, his acclaimed head chef, resigned, citing a fundamental divergence in professional ethics in a quiet email to key investors. The food critics didn't get the email, but the venture capital firms did. Without Daniel running the kitchen, quality at the flagship restaurant dipped. A major deal to expand to Las Vegas collapsed, taking $400 million in projected revenue with it. A crucial partnership with a Napa Valley vineyard was severed. When rumors of the divorce and whispers of financial trouble began to circulate, two of their largest backers, pension funds that prize stability, quietly withdrew their investments. Catherine Vance's social circle began to buzz with gossip. Business was business, and affairs were common. But defrauding your pregnant wife, the respected food critic who had given his career its intellectual shine, that crossed an unwritten line among Chicago's elite. The invitations to charity galas and exclusive chef's table dinners simply stopped coming. With only Isabel's name on his arm, Leo was quietly ostracized. Meanwhile, Isabel was forming her own opinions. She had moved into the Chicago penthouse, the one Elara had meticulously decorated with curated art and custom furniture. Isabel slept in the bed Elara had chosen, used the kitchen Elara had designed, and wore the silk robe Elara had left in the closet. But the penthouse didn't feel like a win. The view of Lake Michigan was breathtaking, but the apartment felt sterile and hollow. It wasn't the temperature, it was the atmosphere. The silence was heavy. The gaps in their conversation were vast. Leo would come home late, his eyes glued to his phone screen through dinner. He spoke to Isabel with the same polished charm he had once used on Elara, the practiced performance of a man reciting lines he no longer felt. He began questioning her industry contacts, casually asking who she was meeting for drinks, not out of interest, but out of a need to control, to manage every relationship the way he managed his inventory. He offered little criticisms of her work. That wine pairing seems a bit obvious, don't you think? At first, the suggestions were subtle. You need to project confidence, Chloe. In this valley, perception is reality. But after any disagreement, Marcus would go dark, ghosting her for days, freezing her out of shared projects and revoking access. It was punishment by digital exile, the same tactic Audrey endured for the last 2 years of their marriage. It's a particular kind of psychological warfare meant to make you question your own value, to force you to obsess over your mistakes until you sand yourself down to fit the perfect, polished image he demands. Chloe finally broke late on a Tuesday, her voice a raw whisper over the encrypted line. "He's not who I thought he was." Audrey was in her family's home in Boston. Her newborn was asleep upstairs, and the historic house was silent except for the faint hum of the city. Her friend had just fixed a squeaky hinge on the library door. A cup of peppermint tea sent steam into the cool air. Outside, the Boston night was a canvas of deep blues and distant lights. She simply listened. She offered no judgment, no easy platitudes. She just listened, the way you listen to a storm warning for a hurricane you've already survived. "I know," Audrey said at last. "I was married to him." She ended the call, finished her tea, and slept peacefully until dawn. The arbitration hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. Audrey's legal team laid out their case with brutal efficiency. The predatory co-founder agreement, the blatant infidelity, the documented emotional manipulation during her pregnancy, and the financial schemes her forensic accountant had unearthed. Hidden crypto wallets, shell corporations registered in Delaware, and company funds diverted to finance a lifestyle of obscene luxury. The arbitrator listened, her expression growing colder with each slide of the presentation. Silicon Valley did not appreciate this level of old-school fraud. Marcus's lawyers sputtered, raising objections and citing obscure clauses. But the blockchain evidence was irrefutable. Without a valid buyout, Audrey was entitled to her founding share, 50% of a $2 billion tech empire. But then Audrey did something that silenced the entire conference room. Not Marcus, not his lawyers, Not even her own lead counsel, David, at first. She didn't touch her half of the company. She took only what her child was owed, a fully funded, unshakable trust for a complete STEM education through the doctorate level, comprehensive lifelong health insurance, and a legally binding clause stating Marcus would have 0 parental rights until he completed 1 year of court-mandated therapy and demonstrated verifiable, consistent behavioral change. That was it. She left the stock options, the Palo Alto mansion, the private jet, and the art collection on the table. Her lawyer was in shock. "You're walking away from $1 billion, he whispered. David, however, managed a small, knowing smile. "She's not trying to bankrupt him," he explained to his associate later that evening. "She's making him irrelevant." "I don't need his stock to have worth," Audrey told a friend that day. "I know my worth. My grandfather made sure of that." The real story broke 2 weeks later, not from a press leak or a court filing. It broke because choices have consequences, and Audrey's choice created an earthquake. The Harrison Foundation. It announced its new flagship initiative, funding the complete digitization of archives for 50 public libraries in struggling school districts, a new grant for emerging digital artists at Carnegie Mellon, and an endowment for a women's health tech incubator in inner-city Boston, all financed by a single anonymous benefactor, Audrey Harrison. A sharp reporter at Wired put the pieces together. The feature story went viral. Quiet Boston curator revealed as Harrison Arts heiress. The tech and news worlds erupted. The story was perfect. The arrogant, new money tech bro, the brilliant but unassuming scholar he betrayed while she carried his child. A hidden Gilded Age fortune that made his tech billions look like a rounding error. It was the kind of story that captivated everyone. The quiet woman he'd dismissed, who was, in fact, royalty in a world he couldn't even enter. Marcus read the article alone in his glass and steel office. His lead developer was gone. The investors were calling with concerns. Chloe had already accepted a senior role at a competitor. He sat at his massive empty desk, staring at Audrey's calm, confident face on his screen as his own turned a washed-out, sickly gray. The color of a man who just realized the woman he called unimportant was worth 10 times more than everything he'd ever coded. He tried to call Audrey. Her number had been disconnected. He called David Chen, her lawyer. A notification popped up on her laptop. It was from Marcus's main server. It was a formal termination notice. "Your access has been revoked," the automated message read, effective immediately. Chloe saw the internal blog post too. She was in a soulless hotel room in Zurich, clutching a coffee mug that had long gone cold. She stared out at the rain-streaked skyline and felt a cold, hard dread settle in her gut. She had tied her career to a rising star in tech, only to become a security risk he had to purge. The limited edition smartwatch on her wrist, a celebratory gift from Marcus, now felt like a cold digital manacle. A junior HR assistant had even misspelled her last name on the exit paperwork, a final petty erasure. Audrey didn't bother correcting anyone. She was far too busy trying to assemble a bassinet, a new one, in a new room, for a new life. Her son arrived on a Tuesday morning in May. Audrey woke at 5:22 a.m. to a pressure that was entirely new. This was nothing like the anxious flutters she'd felt in the cold, minimalist condo she'd shared with Marcus. This was primal, deep, and absolute, the kind of force that arrives without an invitation and takes over everything. She messaged her doula, then she called her mother. After that, she dressed in the quiet pre-dawn light and grabbed the hospital bag that had been packed by the door for a fortnight and drove herself to the hospital. Because she was Audrey Harrison, and Audrey Harrison did not wait for anyone to give her a ride. Her mother showed up 20 minutes later, a whirlwind of energy, her gray hair escaping its elegant twist, wearing garden clogs with a cashmere coat thrown over her pajamas. "I think I broke 3 traffic laws," she announced. "Your grandfather would have been so proud." The labor went on for 10 hours. Audrey didn't cry out. She breathed, she focused, and she gripped her mother's hand with a strength that made her mother's rings dig into her fingers. Her midwife's voice was a calm, steady anchor, a constant presence that guided her through every building wave. Like a beacon in a storm, at 3:37 in the afternoon, he arrived. 8 pounds, 1 ounce, a boy. He entered the world with a roar, not a whimper, but a powerful, indignant roar that declared to the universe, "I am here. This is my time now. Get used to it." They placed him on Audrey's chest, warm and wet and impossibly small, yet astonishingly loud. Audrey looked at the wrinkled, furious face, his eyes squeezed shut and his mouth wide open, and felt a tectonic plate shift deep inside her. It wasn't physical, it was foundational, as if her entire skeleton had been instantly reconfigured to revolve around this tiny, demanding person. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, Oliver James Harrison?" Not King, Harrison, her family's name, a name that carried the weight of history and art. Her mother stood by the bed, tears tracing paths down her face in a beautiful, happy mess. "Oh, little Oliver, you absolute miracle. Your great-grandfather would be beside himself right now, utterly undone with pride." Marcus King was not pacing in the hallway. He hadn't sent a car from his office with an ostentatious display of flowers. He was notified of the birth via a formal, encrypted email from Audrey's lawyer. The message was concise, professional, and contained only the information a biological father was legally required to receive. His reply arrived 32 minutes later. A single word, acknowledged. Audrey saw the forwarded email, deleted it, and picked up her son. She never replied. Arthur Vance, her old thesis advisor from Harvard, sent a stunning hand-drawn card that was delivered to her room the next day. "He is so lucky to have you. Welcome to the world, Oliver James." Audrey taped the card to the nursery wall. It would stay there for the next 18 years. 6 months passed in that strange newborn way. An eternity and the blink of an eye all at once. Every day was a chaotic symphony of feedings, diaper changes, and pre-dawn wakings. Every day was a tiny masterpiece of gurgles, curled fingers, and the profound, grounding weight of a small head on your shoulder. Audrey moved into a classic brownstone in Cambridge, a few blocks from the university. It wasn't a tech palace or a glass-walled penthouse. It was a home. It had 3 bedrooms, a garden in the back, and a porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the lights of Boston begin to glow. Her grandfather's old study was in the front room, which she had made into her home office. Audrey had the large bay windows restored and put her desk where the afternoon light streamed in. Baby Oliver's playmat was on the Persian rug beside it, covered with a soft quilt, a few sensory toys, and a simple wooden block he loved more than anything. She started her work as the new director of the Harrison Foundation. From her half-finished restaurant, blueprints and vendor contracts were spread across a temporary plywood table, surrounded by swatches of leather for the banquettes, samples of custom-made plates, and a lukewarm cup of coffee. She was funding the culinary school that had taught her everything, mentoring young female chefs, and creating a farm-to-table program with local growers, naming it after her grandmother, naturally. Everything finally had meaning. She saw Sophie at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in September. For a second, she almost didn't recognize her. Sophie had shed pounds, the kind of weight that melts off when a secret is burning you up from the inside. A flicker on the new smart home hub, a synced photo album she hadn't noticed before, labeled Golden Gate. A collection of scenic shots, she assumed. She tapped it open. Architectural plans, site surveys, and pictures, dozens of them, of Sophie in their infinity pool, wearing her silk robe, making cocktails in their kitchen. The screen's sterile glow lit Maya's face. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a simple betrayal. It was a hostile takeover, a second life staged in her sanctuary. She swiped through photo after photo, a bitter acid rising in her throat, a jealousy so visceral it felt like a physical blow. Ethan's gleaming San Francisco startup office suddenly felt miles away, its silence broken only by the hum of the climate control and the frantic, suffocating rhythm of her own breathing. She heard the private elevator chime, not with a scream, not with accusations, but with an unnerving calm. Maya turned as Ethan strode in. "I synced your cloud account to the house," she said, her voice steady. A simple fact that vaporized the world they had built. He began to stammer, to rationalize, to deflect, but she raised a single finger. "I don't want the excuses, Ethan. I want you to sit here and think about what you've desecrated." She picked up her keys, walked to the elevator, and left him standing alone, surrounded by the automated, empty life he had programmed but had just permanently crashed. The professional blowback was immediate. The venture capital board got an anonymous tip about his instability, not from Maya, but from a competitor who smelled blood in the water. The crucial second round of funding for his company was frozen pending a founder review. Sophie was promptly reassigned to her firm's Singapore branch and stopped taking Ethan's calls, her ambition proving far stronger than their affair. His co-founders started excluding him from investor pitches. He retreated to his penthouse overlooking the bay, spending his days watching the fog roll in and his nights with a bottle of Japanese. The sleek smart home hub on the kitchen counter was dark, now the screen he'd smashed in a moment of sheer panic after Maya played the video for him. Sasha was there on the screen, laughing in his hotel room, running her hands through her hair. It was a business trip he'd told Maya, just a quick pitch in Seattle. Now Maya was gone, vanished after an hour of screaming accusations, taking nothing but her laptop and the small duffel bag she always kept packed for the hospital. He stood on the cold, polished concrete floor, the same spot where they'd celebrated closing his Series A, funding the same spot where the smart hub screen had shattered against the floor. During their fight, the spiderweb cracks were gone. He'd replaced the unit immediately. But Ethan could feel the fissures tearing through his carefully engineered life. The transparent walls of his Silicon Valley success had become a prison he had locked himself inside. Maya understood that now, curled up on her sister's worn-out sofa in a vibrant Oakland apartment with her laptop open, she could see it clearly. The trap hadn't been Ethan himself. The trap was believing that his world of funding rounds and relentless growth was the only one she was allowed to live in her own talent. A portfolio of stunning graphic design work had been sitting dormant on a cloud drive, so she could finally see the value in her own creation. 2 days had passed. It was a Friday morning. In October, the Bay Area fog was just starting to burn off. Her sister Chloe was at work, a high school art teacher, leaving the apartment quiet with the steady hum of the old refrigerator. Maya was sketching in a notebook for the first time in months, a quiet focus she hadn't felt since before the wedding. The scent of her sister's strong coffee still lingered in the air, the chipped ceramic mug the only thing she grabbed from the condo's kitchen. Sat on the coffee table beside her, the small apartment smelled of turpentine, old paperbacks, and the lavender laundry soap Chloe always used. The intercom buzzed her sister's best friend. A divorce lawyer named Anna stood at the door holding a binder and 2 cups of tea. A weary but determined look on her face. She held the initial consultation papers, the first step in untangling her life from his. "What a monster he is," Anna said, looking at Maya's tear-streaked face. "Your husband has a terrible eye for loyalty." Maya said they signed the retainer agreement on the cluttered dining table. Between a stack of art supplies and a half-eaten bagel, a $5,000 retainer paid from her old savings account with a digital signature that took less than a second. the most terrifying and liberating click of her entire life. Anna left Maya rinsed out the mugs, put them in the dish rack, refilled her water bottle, and started blocking out the sections of her online portfolio. She worked slowly, feeling every decision. The font choices were crisp. The water was cold. Her sister's old college sweatshirt felt soft against her skin. It had soaked up the anxiety of 1,000 all-night study sessions and offered its comfort to her now after her silent drive across the bridge. She had kicked off her sneakers by the door, touched her round stomach, feeling the soft flutter of her son inside her palm, and inhaled the familiar scent of Chloe's apartment paint and brewing tea. She walked over to the bay window and sat on the cushion her sister had made, curled her feet under her. The baby stirred as if listening for what came next. Her sister's scruffy terrier hopped onto the sofa beside her. Chloe's words from their phone call filled the silence, sharp and unwavering, the same promise she'd made after every crisis, the same vow that always felt like a lifeline. A sister's protection isn't a negotiation. It doesn't need an explanation. It doesn't hesitate. It just shows up full force every time the baby fluttered again, as if he understood. Maya began to rub her belly in slow circles, a quiet promise to the life inside her, her grandmother's promise, the one she always whispered when Maya had nightmares, the words that filled their tiny childhood bedroom. In the outer sunset, every time she was scared, creating a shield that ambition could never penetrate and betrayal could never fully break. She closed her eyes the way her grandmother taught her, find the hurt and breathe into it. Maya, that's how you make it smaller. She trusted her sister. She trusted the tiny life within her for the first time in years. The feeling of being safe settled over the small apartment, seeping through the old window panes into the living room, where a podcast was playing, drifting down the hall, where a neighbor was practicing the violin, and traveling deep inside a life that felt broken and chaotic and profoundly wrong. But that also contained in its wreckage the fierce power of a mother's promise to her unborn son. The perfect minimalist nursery was a room she would never go back to, scrubbed clean of her future. But a new life would be designed from scratch. Legacies of love always are. This narrative was intentionally developed and produced by our team to explore modern betrayals and the strength found in crisis. Every character, every action, and every emotional turn was created to connect, to engage, and to remind you that your own path is worth fighting for. Thank you for joining us in this story.